Hello and welcome. My name is Adrian Stevens, and today we're going to talk about accessing OAuth2 web services using Xamarin.Auth. And we'll start by discussing authorization when communicating with an OAuth2 protected server. So with this, we'll do a quick review of some of those core OAuth2 concepts, look at specific values that we need to send from our application, and then we'll explore a free component published by Xamarin called Xamarin.Auth. And we'll use Xamarin.Auth to authenticate our users and authorize our application to access protected resources. Now, authentication and authorization in OAuth2 is a complicated process, and it involves quite a few back and forth steps. So we start by sending client applications credentials over HTTP to the authorization server. Now, the server returns an HTML page that the user or the owner of the data uses to log in and authenticate. If the login is successful, the server will redirect the HTML to indicate to the application the login is complete. And with the redirect, an access token is provided. And now our client app needs to extract and store the access token, which it will then use to access protected data stored on the server. Now, note, this slide is showing the implicit flow. There's another flow called the authorization code flow that actually has more steps. Now, it's possible to manage all of the steps to authorize and authenticate manually, but it's considered good practice to use a known tested library. And in this class, we'll be using Xamarin.Auth to provide the client-side OAuth2 validation. This is written and actively maintained by Xamarin, and it supports both Xamarin iOS and Xamarin Android. And it's available as a NuGet package. Now, keep in mind that most popular social networks provide their own plugins, and if you're only using one or two OAuth providers, I would strongly recommend preferring those plugins. Now, Xamarin.Auth is meant as a generic or general solution, and is great when you have services that don't have specific plugins available. And there's also other cross-platform plugins being developed, so it's always best to do your research and pick the best tool or the best package for your application. Xamarin.Auth is designed to simplify the steps required by a developer to access an OAuth2 protected service. It will manage the mechanics of authentication and authorization, and it wraps it into a nice, easy-to-use API. You'll provide your application's generated credentials, the redirection endpoint URI, and the server URLs for the service you're accessing. And if the information is correct, Xamarin.Auth will retrieve and present the login HTML. Now, when the login is successful, Xamarin.Auth will detect the redirect and extract the access token. So what exactly do we need to supply as developers? Well, we need the values to uniquely identify our app. This includes the client ID and the client secret, along with the redirection endpoint. Now, most OAuth2 services allow a scope to be specified when requesting the access token, and this scope will also be provided to Xamarin.Auth. And we need to tell Xamarin.Auth where it needs to connect in order to authorize and authenticate. This includes the authorization endpoint and the token endpoint. Now remember, if you're using the implicit flow, you will not need to include the client secret or the token endpoint. And the Xamarin.Auth APIs have been designed for both scenarios. Now, the OAuth scopes that you set determine what the external app is allowed to do. So what data can it access? Does it have access to the user's profile? Is it able to get a refresh token or possibly other things? So how do we decide what scopes to include? Well, the simple answer is choose the most restrictive scopes or add the least amount of data access you can possibly get away with for your app to do its work. And that way, if your app is ever compromised, we limit the amount of damage, the amount of information that could be potentially leaked. Now remember that valid scope values are often unique to the service being accessed, and you'll need to consult the service's documentation. And this is again why it's sometimes preferable to use a plugin or a package that's specific to the service you're trying to access. Now there are some conventions when passing scope values, and they should be separated by spaces, and they are case sensitive. Now, the authorization endpoint is a web URL, and it's used to request authorization for your client app. The server is public, and it's ready to respond to authorization requests. Your application sends the client credentials, and the authorization server returns the login HTML. Now, to find the authorization endpoint, again, you'll need to consult your particular service's documentation. And as an example, this slide is showing Dropbox's authorization endpoint URL. Now, the token endpoint is used to exchange an authorization token for an access token. On most servers, the client secret is required for this step. As mobile developers will only use the token endpoint for the authorization code flow, not used in the implicit flow. And again, to find the token endpoint, you know what I'm going to say, you need to consult the service's documentation. This is typically a different URL from the authorization endpoint, and it may even be on a different domain. And this is actually the case here with Dropbox. Now, we'll need all of this information present in our code before authenticating. Now, on this slide, we see a complete set of values to access data on Google+ using the authorization code flow. And if you're using the implicit flow, you wouldn't include the client secret or the token endpoint. Now, in the XamarinAuth APIs, we use the Authenticator class to request the HTML login and retrieve the access token. There is an Authenticator base class and 2 derived classes for both OAuth1 and OAuth2. And in this course, we'll only be using the OAuth2 Authenticator. The OAuth2 Authenticator will handle the entire OAuth2 authentication and authorization sequence. You instantiate an OAuth2 Authenticator object, and you pass in the required values via the constructor, and it's going to handle the specific details, including presenting a platform-specific web control for the login. Now, many applications like to personalize the user experience by programmatically retrieving the user's preferred name and maybe including it in the UI. And there are various ways to get the user's name, and this will vary by server or service. So it's not standardized as part of the OAuth2 spec. So if you want your app to do this, you'll need to write custom code to get the username. Now, this might involve a round trip to the server to run a query. And XamarinAuth actually provides a bit of mechanics. It has an API here to allow you to automatically run this little bit of custom code after the OAuth process has succeeded. And you can optionally provide the authenticator with a delegate to retrieve the username. Now, these are the results of the OAuth2 Auth process, and the server may include the username here. Or you can use the access token to request the username from the server. You'll need to parse the account properties or your custom response and return the username. And this varies again by service, and the specific implementation is going to be up to you. Now, the OAuth2 Authenticator supports both the implicit flow and the authorization code flow. The flow is selected based on the constructor overload used to instantiate the instance. So the implicit flow requires the client ID, scope, authorization URI, and the redirection endpoint. And then we see the larger constructor, and the authorization code flow requires all of those values as well as the client secret and token endpoint URI, as we would expect. So to create an OAuth2 Authenticator, well, we'll just instantiate it and pass in the correct constructor values. And the example shown here is, of course, for the implicit flow. Now, the Authenticator gives you the correct login UI for whichever platform your code is currently running on, but it does not display the login screen for you. You'll need to write some platform-specific code to show the login screen. Now, notice the call to get UI returns an object, and this will need to be cast to the correct type depending on the platform. Now, the call to get UI will create a full screen UI with an embedded web control. This will be a UI web view on iOS and a web view on Android. For iOS, the getUI method actually returns a UI view controller, which has the child UI web view. Now, you can use any method you like to present the view controller, and this will likely depend on your application's navigation structure. In this example, we're calling presentViewController from the root controller and then wrapping the provided view in a navigation controller to display the navigation bar. On Android, the getUI method returns an intent, which is then used to display a new activity. And in this example, we're calling start activity, passing in the intent returned from our authenticator. The authenticator object exposes a completed event, and it's raised, well, when the user has attempted to log in after calling getUI. We can check to see if the user has been authenticated by checking the isAuthenticated property. Now, specific details about the server are also passed in via the account property as an account object. Now, XamarinAuth has an account class, and this is used to represent user information and details. And it has three properties. It has a username, which is stored as a string. It has a dictionary of type string, and this can store user details. And it has a cookie container that can store cookies for web services that control access via cookies. Now, because of the flexibility of the properties dictionary, the account object is very flexible in what it can store. Now, the access token is provided when the completed event handler is raised. The token itself is stored as a string in the properties dictionary and is stored using access_token as the key. The OAuth2 Authenticator will raise an error event when a problem occurs. So to respond to errors, subscribe to the error event on the instance of your OAuth2 Authenticator, which will provide an Authenticator error event args. Exceptions will be included in the exception property if one occurs. Otherwise, this property will be null. And the message property will always provide a string description of the error, and this is in English. If an exception occurs, then the message will be taken from the innermost exception. Now, we can use XamarinAuth to persist access tokens securely. We then use the access token in subsequent sessions, meaning that the user will not need to log in every time the application is run. So, when the onCompleted event is raised, we instantiate an account store and then use the save method with a unique string, the service ID, to store the account object passed in with authenticator completed event args. Now remember, the account object holds the access token. Then, when we need to retrieve the access token, we instantiate an account store object and then call the findAccountsForService method to retrieve the account object passed in via the service ID. Accessing the web service is just a matter of making calls to a REST service while ensuring we include the access token. So we would first concatenate the API address and our query, add the access token to the HTTP header, and then use a networking API such as HTTP client to send the query. And this can be done manually, and the details of accessing REST services from a Xamarin application is covered in our class on REST services. However, XamarinAuth helps reduce the amount of steps required to access the data. So I'm going to introduce you to another object in the XamarinAuth API called request. And request is a base class that performs most of the work of sending and receiving HTTP requests. There are two derived classes, OAuth1 request and OAuth2 request. And I'm pretty sure you can guess which one we're going to use. We'll be using the OAuth2 version, OAuth2 request. Now, this class will properly format an HTTP request. It will add the access token and it'll send it to the correct server endpoint. And it'll also capture the response. It's actually doing a lot of work for us. So to use OAuth2 request, you'll create that request object, pass it in your query and the account object that was returned by their onCompleted event. Remember, that holds the access token. And then OAuth2 request takes care of the specific details of running the request. And it will return the results encapsulated in a response object. We'll take a closer look at the response object in just a couple of minutes. So notice that the constructor of OAuth2 request expects an account object. And this helps ensure the access token contained within the properties dictionary of our account object is present. Now, OAuth2 request adds the access token to the request URL, and if you want to pass it in to the HTTP authorization header, you'll have to format the request yourself. And XamarinAuth can help you with this step as well. You're going to call the getAuthorizationHeader method on the request instance, which will return the access token, and you'll then need to format your own request to place this in the header. Now, most servers use access token as the name of the token HTTP parameter, and OAuth2 request lets you specify a different name if your service requires it. So to change the name, set the access token parameter name property on the OAuth2 request. Now, OAuth2 request accepts and encapsulates the details of your query. The method parameter accepts the HTTP verb as a string, and the URL parameter needs to be a server address such as a URI. And you can include additional query parameters passed in as a dictionary of strings, and these will be added to the end of the query. And XamarinAuth requests can handle HTTP multi-part requests, and this is often useful when uploading files. And as you can see on the slide, there are two overloads of the add multi-part data method on the request class. The first accepts data as a string, or you can supply a stream along with the MIME type. And XamarinAuth returns a response object, and this represents the server's response to your HTTP request. The response contains an HTTP status code numeration, so it would be 202 for accepted, 504 for gateway timeout, etc. And you can reach the full response using either the getResponseText async method, which returns the server status response as a string, or getResponseStream async, which, as you'd expect, returns the response as a stream. So let's look at an example performing an HTTP GET. First, prepare the request by instantiating an OAuth2 request object. Then, call the getResponseAsync method, which returns the response object. And then use either of the getResponse methods to obtain the response as a string or stream. And we're obtaining a string here in this example. Now, in the OAuth2 specs, the OAuth2 bearer token usage specification describes how the server should respond to invalid requests. Now, as we saw earlier, the error code appears in the response object status code property. And 400 would be a bad request, 401 is unauthorized, 403 is forbidden, and 405 method not allowed. Now, we can recognize a bad request, a 400. In this case, the status code will be set to http status code.badRequest. And if you receive this error, check to ensure that you've included all of the required parameters and ensure they're valid for the specific flow that you're using. Now, another common error is 401, unauthorized. Now, this often occurs when your access token expires. The status code will equal http status code unauthorized, and you may need to refresh the token, or the user may have revoked access to your application. And either way, you won't be able to use your current access token to access data on the server. And let's look at one more common status code, and this is 403, forbidden. Now, this typically happens when you try to access a protected resource that is outside of the scope of your access token. And the status code will equal HTTP status code forbidden. And you'll either need to request a new access token with increased scope or continue to work without that requested data. Now, if you need further information to diagnose a status code, check the Authenticate response header for further details. And the information provided will vary by server, and in this example, we'll see a response from the Google's APIs when trying to use an invalid access token. Now, most access tokens are short-lived, and when the token expires, we'll need a new token to continue to access the secured web service. And rather than asking the user to repeatedly log in, we'll use something called a refresh token. And so we'll start by looking at how to determine the lifespan of an access token. We'll explore the requirements for receiving a refresh token, and then we'll use the refresh token to retrieve new access tokens when our current token expires. So, as I said, most access tokens are short-lived, and once it expires, the user no longer has access to the data. To regain access, we could restart the authentication flow, but this is a bit of an interruption to the user. They're required to stop using the app and re-enter their credentials via the login HTML. And unfortunately, as developers, we rarely have control over the lifetime of the token. This is determined by the service, and it isn't standardized. So to improve the user experience, some servers' access tokens never expire. Now, this improved experience comes at the expense of reduced security. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, some services use very short-lived access tokens. Now, 1 hour is relatively common. So, how do we check the lifetime? Well, a good place to start is in the documentation for your particular service. But many services will also include the expiration time when the access token is delivered. Very convenient. So if it is available, it's going to be in that account object properties dictionary, and it should be indexed by the expires_in key. And the expiration time is reported in seconds. Now, we can't control the token lifetime, but we can use something called refresh. And as you might expect, refresh allows a client app to get a new access token when the existing token expires. Now, a short-lived token is obtained after the user logs in, and when that token expires, we're able to get a new one. And we're often able to obtain a new access token without user interaction, meaning the user doesn't have to log in again. A refresh token is a string the client can send to the server to get that new access token. And the refresh tokens are issued to the client by the authorization server. Now, refresh tokens are not required by the OAuth spec, and not all servers will issue refresh tokens. Now, generally, servers that support refresh tokens require that you use the authorization code flow. Now, the implicit flow will not yield a refresh token. Now, some servers automatically provide a refresh token when the access token is delivered when using authorization code flow, and some servers require a specific scope in order to yield that refresh token. Again, you can check the server documentation. Now, some servers require an additional parameter in your request in order to give you a refresh token. Now, Xamarin.Auth allows you to include the extra parameters by adding them to your scope, and you'll also need to set the do not escape scope property to true. As an example, Google requires access_type equals offline to be added when requesting an access token in order for refresh token to be delivered. Other servers use different strings, and some do not require additional parameters. As always, consult the server's documentation. And again, as we see the complexity here, this is another good point to pause and remind you that when you can use a service's specific plugin to access the server's data, it might be preferable. And again, XamarinAuth is a good general solution, but you can see there's a little bit more complexity. Now, the refresh flow is a single request response to the server to exchange the refresh token for a new access token. So we send the client ID, the client secret, and of course the refresh token, and then we get back an access token, a new access token. Now, some servers give you a new refresh token every time you perform the refresh flow. Others give you a single refresh token when the user first authenticates, and then your app will use the same refresh token every time you need to perform refresh. Now, because of the variations between different servers, the entire refresh flow is not built into XamarinAuth. There's just too much variation. However, the OAuth2 Authenticator can be used to assist in performing this refresh flow. So, instantiate a new OAuth2 Authenticator instance, create a dictionary of strings to hold the server-specific query values needed for refresh, and then to start the refresh flow, call refresh access token async. Remember, the account object that you obtained when the user first authenticated holds the refresh token. And again, most servers don't issue new refresh tokens, so you'll need to store this for future refresh flows. Unlike the other flows, the refresh flow requirements aren't strongly defined, and they can really vary widely between servers. Generally, you'll be required to send the refresh token you acquired during authentication, along with the client ID and the client secret. And it's commonly required to specify the grant type as refresh token. Again, this is not in the spec, but it's common, and this is how we tell the server we're requesting a new access token. And we pass these values to the OAuth2 Authenticator as a dictionary of strings. Now, the request access token async returns the results of the refresh flow as a dictionary of strings. And if the refresh was successful, a new access token should be stored in the dictionary using the key access_token. Some servers will also provide a new refresh token. Make sure to update both tokens in your account object and save it to the account store if this is the case. And this brings us to the end of our class today. Thank you so much for joining me here. Now, hopefully you have a much better understanding about what's required to access an OAuth 2 protected service. And we saw there's a lot of variation in how OAuth 2 is implemented, especially when it comes to things like scope and refresh. And I want to remind you again that if you have the option to use a vendor or service-specific plugin to access a website or service, I highly recommend you do so. For example, using a Microsoft plugin for a Microsoft protected service or something from Google or Dropbox. Definitely use those vendor-specific plugins. They're going to be customized specifically for their services. Setting things like the scope and refresh are going to be much, much easier. If you don't have a specific plugin available or you need to support multiple services, a more generic solution like XamarinAuth might be a good option. Again, thank you very much. My name is Adrian Stevens. If you're looking for more cross-platform mobile educational content, of course, head to university.xamarin.com and have a great day.